And this is part 2 of Freedom. We walked out of Lewiston Narrows on a hot April day, and the terrain laid down as it ran west till the Alleghenies were just a distant presence at the edges of the farmland. From a hilltop, we could see where they would close back in again, but for now, the Juniata just drew big, wide meanders through the cornfields and river bottom. The rail lines had an ample maintenance road, and trestles 100 yards wide meant we didn't have to worry about what was bearing down on us while we crossed the river. It was flat, open country with plenty of firewood and drinking water and innumerable places to sleep, even if you just stopped and laid down where you were. The lines ran second across a big river bend outside Lewistown, and then plunged westward past Granville and Anderson, finally a scattering of houses named Mattawanna, where we lay down in some underbrush by the river and went to sleep. We were moving before people woke up in their houses, and the country was easy passage now. Small towns miles apart and farmland almost to the horizon. Trains slammed past every half hour. Norfolk, Southern, Intermodal, Hamburg Sud, Clipper. We didn't even bother hiding from them. The quantity of what America needed was hard to comprehend. 3 straight minutes of cattle cars lumbering by with their barnyard stench. A mile of double-stacked Connexes coming out of Newark and Philly. Endless coal trains like a special delivery from hell. A trackside cross marked the spot where a teenager lost his life some years prior. We walked all day and made Mount Union in the early evening, walked down a deserted main street that must have been 100 yards wide in a town that couldn't have had more than 3,000 people. There was a restaurant at the edge of town with 1 cook, 1 waitress, and no customers. We walked in with our packs and our dog, and no one said a word. The waitress was young and asked when we were coming back through. One of us said, "Never. Why don't you join us?" And she laughed and took our order. We were back up on the rail by nightfall. There was almost no moon, but underfoot was packed cinder that we could easily walk with headlamps or even no light at all. We walked Jack's Narrows at night, past Mapleton and Birdville as they slept, and crossed back over the Juniata after Smith's Run, where the river jags north. Jack Armstrong was a trader who was killed by Indians in the winter of 1744. A search party reported finding nothing but his shoulder bone. We chose our stopping place poorly in the dark, woke before dawn in a foul weed patch, made a breakfast of peanut butter and cold coffee, and set out for Huntington. That was where the original Standing Stone had been. That was the center of the Onondaga world. There was a cafe at Huntington Station with outdoor tables that had a few people at them waiting for an eastbound Amtrak. We walked right in off the tracks and sat down. We'd moved 40 miles in 40 hours and felt like wolves. We ordered coffees and a plateful of whatever pastries they had, and bagels with cream cheese toasted and wrapped in wax paper. When we couldn't eat any more, we stood ourselves back up on leg muscles that had already set like concrete and hoisted our packs and moved on. The river shot a gorge above Huntington that breached another ridge, which ran dead straight past the Potomac almost to the Shenandoah. It was still remote, inaccessible country that could only be reached by boat. From time to time, we passed someone's fishing camp, usually a tent or tar paper shack, sat just above flood stage with a spring-shot armchair or couch moldering in front of a fire pit. A skiff tethered out front if anyone was home, working back and forth in the current like a dog with something wrong with it. The river hooked south at Petersburg and finally crossed a broad floodplain that had corn and wheat fields on either side. The mountains rose up again but were easily breached at Barry. There were clean, sweet creeks coming off the uplands and no houses or people to speak of who might notice our passing. The weather backed around to the northeast, and we made camp on a steep little hill above a cold spring that welled straight out of the rock. It was Saturday. We could hear cars and trucks gunning along 453 on the other side of the river. We were always worried about the locals, and on a weekend night it seemed like a good idea to sleep at a place that was hard to find and easy to leave. If they came up on one side, we'd go down the other. If that didn't work, we'd stay on top and see how badly they wanted this. We made a hot little fire of dead spruce and cooked enchiladas on a flat piece of railroad steel and went to sleep under our tarp before the rains came tapping in for the night. Sometimes we could find a perfect place to sleep within sight of a suburban development. We'd use the red filter on our headlamps so no one would see us. Sometimes wide open country would give us nothing but rocks and corn stubble. South of Havre de Grace, we walked half of the night without finding a good spot. Finally lay down on top ballast just feet from the rails themselves. We were so close we could hear steel ringing before the big freights blew through. Each one was so catastrophically loud that in our half-sleep we were sure it had jumped the tracks or was coming down some rail spur we'd mistakenly bedded down on. In the morning, one guy sat up and said, "I'd rather be mortared," which was something he knew about because he'd once caught some metal in his elbow during a firefight in Afghanistan. There were countless ways to get killed. Sleeping on the track bed was definitely one of them. Drunks and suicides and teenagers with headphones get hit all the time between the rails, but there are less obvious dangers as well. Metal strapping can come unlimbered from its load and perform a kind of spastic dance alongside a moving train that will cut you in half. Steel wheels going 140 and bearing many tons of weight can shoot chunks of rock sideways off the rails like bullets. Cargo dangles and flails and falls from cars. An engineer was almost killed by a piece of timber that worked loose from its load and came straight through his cab from an oncoming train. He survived by dropping like a boxer under a right cross. The towns, the cops, the freight companies, no one wanted us on the lines, which is understandable. In fact, over the course of 400 miles, we failed to come up with a single moral or legal justification for what we were doing, other than the dilute principle that we weren't causing actual harm, so we should be able to keep doing it. Best way to not get caught was to not be seen. Most of the time that was surprisingly easy. If you hear a train, step into the underbrush. If you're walking up an overpass or grade crossing, put the binoculars on it to make sure no one in uniform is waiting for you. If there's nowhere to hide when a train comes through, wave at the engineer. If he doesn't wave back, assume he's going to call you in. If he calls you in, hide in the woods and smoke a cigarette or boil some coffee until the cops roll past. If the cops roll past in one direction, they're going to roll back in the other. If an hour goes by and they still haven't come, you can take your chances and step back onto the rail, or you can wait until dark. Then you can do whatever you want, because everything that moves faster than you out there must use headlights. Those can be seen a mile out. There are disadvantages to moving 3 miles an hour in a world that's mostly going 70 or 80, but there are also advantages. You can hide virtually anywhere and will probably see everyone else before they see you. Your largest vulnerability is someone coming from behind. You can have everyone glance backward regularly on their own initiative. That kind of random surveillance is almost impossible to defeat. We got good at staying out of sight, but still had our close calls. A day south of Wilmington, a maintenance crew rolled up on us from behind. The foreman told us to get off the tracks. 20 minutes later, we watched from the woods as 2 Amtrak cops turned past in an SUV. We paralleled the tracks slowly through the woods for the rest of the day, then made up our mileage at night. And one night, north of Baltimore, we were walking late to avoid the heat, and suddenly the darkness was filled with lights and sirens and the heavy whop, whop, whop of a helicopter at low altitude. There wasn't much we could do but crouch down in tall grass and hope they didn't have infrared. We watched a cone of light wobble toward us, and then pass within 100 feet before continuing on up the line. Came back later to rerun its grid, but by then we'd laid back and gone to sleep. We got up a couple hours later and hoisted our bags and staggered off like exhausted drunks. We didn't know how much trouble we were in, but wanted to make sure we were outside their search grid before people were back at their desks in the morning. By definition, everyone we met on railroad property was breaking the law, so they tended to be either very friendly or very guarded. Once we saw a guy step off the track bed when he spotted us and carefully fit a pair of gloves onto his hands. He then pulled something out of his rucksack, and slid it into his back pocket and dropped the ruck on the ground and waited. He gave himself as much standoff as possible and stood watching us carefully and not smiling. His right hand stayed by his waist, and his left hand held a 3-foot length of rebar with a U-shaped fixture welded to the bottom. We stopped to talk so he wouldn't think we'd seen his gun. He said he was a snake catcher. This was his snake iron. He walked the lines every day looking for snakes. He didn't say what he did with them or how much he made a living from it, and I didn't ask. He added that he was new in town. If he packed up and disappeared overnight, no one would even notice, which I took to be a warning. I said goodbye, and when we were out of pistol range, I turned to look. He was still standing there with his snake iron, staring. The railroad lines we followed were there because that's where the settler roads had been. The settler roads were there because that's where the Indian trails had been. The Indian trails were there because 250 million years ago, the Juniata River had sawed her way through the shale and limestone strata of that country faster than tectonic forces could lift them up. Harder stone, such as granite, diverts rivers and creates barriers that people generally have to go around. Juniata offered a way through the Allegheny front that had no visible alternatives for hundreds of miles. The southern option went up the Potomac River and through the mountains of West Virginia. The northern option went by canal from upstate New York to Lake Erie. The United States of the early 1800s, when the first railroads were built, had a relatively small population and very little capital. In order to compete with Europe, the federal government faced the prospect of spending a huge amount of money on infrastructure. Otherwise, the new democracy would remain an economic backwater that was fatally divided between a thriving East Coast and an inaccessible interior. Transporting a bushel of wheat 300 miles from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia cost more than the wheat was worth at market. America's rugged geography was something that private enterprise couldn't hope to conquer on its own. To solve the problem, America's Swiss-born Treasury Secretary Albert Gallatin proposed a massive infrastructure plan that would subsidize a network of roads and canals linking cities like Baltimore and Philadelphia with the Ohio River Valley. Although the plan was not passed, most of the projects Gallatin proposed in 1808 were eventually built, including a crucial rail and canal route up the Juniata. America's wealth can be traced in part to Gallatin's efforts to overcome his new country's aversion to federal investment and espouse a grander vision. A statue of Gallatin stands at the northern entrance of the Treasury Building in Washington, D.C. 20 years after Gallatin's proposal, the inaugural spadeful of earth for a subsidized national railroad was turned by a man named Charles Carroll, who was the last surviving signatory of the Declaration of Independence. Carroll claimed to be prouder of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad than of the historic document he'd signed, believing that a national transportation system, coupled with America's vast resources and almost unlimited immigrant and slave labor, could create the most powerful country on earth. He was right. That vision required both a massive expansion of government as well as the wholesale violation of property rights. It also required overlooking the moral outrage of slavery, which was an economic asset that the federal government was not yet willing to question. Railroads require a huge amount of land. To build a national system, the government had to seize and redistribute an area equivalent to the entire state of South Carolina. The land was seized under the principle of eminent domain, which holds that the government can force the sale of private property if it's overwhelmingly in the public interest. Two irreconcilable forms of freedom were at stake: a nation's freedom to maximize its own prosperity and an individual's freedom to own and control land. Prosperity won. In the words of an 1837 court case named Bloodgood versus Mohawk, it was the railroad's ability to annihilate distance that made it indispensable to the public good, and therefore unstoppable in court. The building of America's railroads was the largest and most ambitious public works project of the industrial era and consumed men almost as fast as it did steel and timber. Railroad work relied on high explosives to blow holes through inconvenient geography. It was so dangerous that slave owners often refused to contract out their slaves because they didn't want to lose them. Workers throughout the rest of the country and much of the South were often Irish and Chinese immigrants who arrived in America so poor that railroad companies felt free to essentially work them to death. Roughly 1,200 men died working on the Transcontinental Railroad, for example, though the exact number is not known because employers didn't even bother keeping careful records. Like warfare, building a railroad is crushingly monotonous when it isn't absolutely deadly. First, surveyors staked out routes that made huge detours around anything they couldn't blast through. Timber fallers then cleared first-growth forest with axes and cross-cut saws and blew massive stumps out of the ground with dynamite. Only then could an army of laborers start leveling the track bed. When the laborers were done, cross ties and rails were laid out on top ballast, and the whole thing was pinned down by spikers, who counted 3 strokes to the spike, 10 spikes to the railroad, 400 rails to the mile. A good crew could lay a mile of track a day, except in the mountains, where thousands of men could be stalled in the same place for months. Prostitutes, con men, gamblers, and murderers poured into these work camps as soon as they were established. The frontier was the principal area of single male brutality, observes historian David Courtwright, who has studied violence in all male groups. The surplus of young men, widespread bachelorhood, sensitivity about honor, racial hostility, heavy drinking, religious indifference, group indulgence in vice, ubiquitous armament, and inadequate law enforcement were concentrated on the frontier. Railroad towns and other male-dominated communities had mortality rates that rivaled battlefields. That did not change until women began to migrate westward and have children. The railroad town of Laramie, Wyoming, had so many murders that the town undertaker often just carted the bodies into the desert and dumped them. Benton, Wyoming lost 7% of its population to murder in the first 2 months of its existence. As dangerous as railroad work was, a Union Pacific employee was 4 times more likely to die after hours in towns like Benton and Laramie than on the job itself. The dangers didn't end after the railroads were built. Early steam engines were considered so risky that the president of the Erie Railroad insisted on doing the inaugural run entirely alone in case there was an accident. Railroad technology was brand new. There were dangers associated with it that no engineer or actuary could possibly think up. Who could have imagined a swarm of grasshoppers so thick that their crushed bodies could derail trains in Pennsylvania in 1836? How could a 23-year-old railroad worker named Edwin Harrington have known that a frog, a mechanical track switch, would grab his foot and not let go until a train ran him over in 1873? And when O.M. Wilmot leaned out the window of his locomotive while driving over a Vermont bridge in 1894, why would he worry about clearances that were so tight a post would take his head off? Workers usually died individually. Passengers often died by the trainload. 89 people lost their lives when an iron trestle failed in its entirety, so-called square fall, dropped a whole train into a gorge near Ashtabula, Ohio, in 1876. Many people who survived the fall died in fires that were ignited by lanterns and coal stoves in the wreckage. 88 people drowned in their compartments when a trestle failed and shunted their train into a flooded creek outside Eden, Colorado in 1904. These tragedies could have been prevented by better track maintenance. Hard to guard against were the complex interactions of trains, signals, and bad timing. In 1905, a mile-long freight train, moving only 6 miles an hour, braked to avoid a collision in the Harrisburg yards and pitched some of its boxcars onto another track. Unfortunately, one of those tracks was packed with dynamite, which was detonated by a passenger train that just happened to pass at that moment. 23 people were killed and more than 100 injured. Some of the oldest survivors must have thought they were back on the battlefields of Gettysburg. Industrial carnage was new to society, and civilians were not prepared for it. In fact, the first medical diagnosis for psychological trauma was called a railroad spine, because it was so closely associated with the mass casualties of railroad accidents. In 1903, the Duquesne Limited was running at 60 miles an hour outside Cannellsville, Pennsylvania, she hit a load of timber that had fallen off the freight train that preceded her. It was nighttime, and the timber was strewn along a curve, so the engineer had no chance to throw the brakes. The baggage car derailed and was hurled into the Youghiogheny River. A smoking car, packed with men who had come forward from the passenger cars, flipped and landed on the engine. The impact cracked the boiler, which was pressurized to 300 pounds per square inch. Escaping steam cooked the passengers alive. Since very few women smoked, they were mostly in Pullman cars at the rear and could hear their husbands screaming as they died. The force of the collision demolished the engine, ripped almost every car off its truck, threw a 7,000-gallon water tank entirely over the train, and killed 78 people. The tracks had all the dangers of heavy industry, but also ran smack through nature. The trains were so heavy and loud, though, it was easy for us to forget they weren't the only danger out there. In central Pennsylvania, we got caught in a summer thunderstorm that soaked us immediately, sent runoff boiling out of culverts and sheeting down hillsides. It was almost dark. There was nowhere to sleep that wasn't badly angled or completely underwater. One of the men finally looked at me and said, "You know, I must really want to be out here because I have way better options than this." We'd all been in a certain amount of combat, and there was something about our endeavor, the simplicity, the hardship, the proximity of death, that reminded us of those days. Most of the trip was done in segments over the course of a year. Halfway through, one man dropped out and others later filled in. In one section, there was just the two of us. We called our trip the Last Patrol. It seemed like a long, hard, weird thing to do till we actually were out there, when suddenly it was so obvious that we rarely even caught ourselves wondering why we were doing it. The things that had to happen out there were so clear and simple. Eat, walk, hide, sleep. Just getting through the day felt like scripture, a true and honest accounting of everything that underlies the frantic performance of life. The night of the downpour, we slept under a hardware store tarp in a patch of skunkweed near the river. I stayed awake listening to the wind in case it ramped up to that high shriek that means treetops are going to start snapping. I decided if that happened, we would wade into the current and sit out the storm on a little brush-covered island I'd spotted. No falling trees could reach us there. I doubted the river would rise beyond what we could handle. In the morning, the river was at our toes and the island was gone. If we'd gone out there, we'd probably be dead. That was scripture. That was the world letting you know where you stood. The temptation to ignore reality while believing in a divine benevolence that will protect you from harm has gotten a lot of people killed over the ages. What truly is benevolent, though, what will save you over and over or often die trying, are other people. In 1996, a southbound MARC commuter train with 150 passengers ran a signal outside Silver Springs, Maryland, wound up on a collision course with a northbound Amtrak headed for Chicago. The MARC had her engine in the rear, which meant that the lead passenger car would absorb most of the impact. The engineer had roughly 15 seconds. He threw the brake and ran forward through his train, shouting warnings to the passengers. The 130-ton Amtrak engine ripped the lead MARC car in half lengthwise, set the whole thing on fire with spilled diesel. All 3 crew members died trying to save people in the lead car. All but 8 passengers made it out alive. The engineer's reaction was not one that could be taught or drilled into him. It was almost certainly instinctive. The willingness to risk death for non-kin is unique to humans. It may serve to keep large groups from splitting into smaller ones that would have an even harder time defending themselves. The word freedom comes from Vriedom, which means beloved in medieval German. It's thought to reflect the idea that only people in one's immediate group were considered worthy of having rights or protection. Outsiders, on the other hand, could be tortured, enslaved, or killed at will. This was true throughout the world and for most of human history. Neither law, nor religion, nor common decency held otherwise. The corollary was that if the enemy was not going to show mercy, you might as well fight to the death. Freedom as a supreme value was born of the fact that there were really no alternatives worth considering. The result was that the freest people were often the most warlike. Nearly 1,000 Sicily Jews committed mass suicide in the besieged city of Masada in 73 BC, for example, when it became clear that Roman soldiers would eventually breach the walls and enslave everyone they didn't kill. According to Roman accounts, each man supposedly killed his own family and then drew straws to kill one another till the last man killed himself. The Romans entered a city that was entirely inhabited by the dead. The genetic consequences of surrender or defeat could be catastrophic. Around 5,000 years ago, nomadic steppe horsemen known as Yamnaya migrated across Europe and invaded the Iberian Peninsula. They were an exceedingly aggressive, hierarchical people who traveled in all-male groups and fought with axes from the backs of horse-drawn chariots. The Iberians had probably never even seen a horse before, much less ridden one. Over the course of several generations, the Yamnaya either killed or somehow outbred the entire male population of Iberia, but spared the lives of the young women, whose DNA, along with that of their conquerors, can still be found in the modern population of Spain. The men failed to repel the invaders and were entirely scrubbed from the human gene pool. Granting rights to the vanquished was a radical idea that did not establish itself in Western thought until the mid-17th century, when a Dutch scholar named Hugo Grotius began his attempt to regulate warfare by observing that men must not believe that nothing is allowable or that everything is. It could be said that the idea of personal freedom as a legal right to be extended by the powerful to the weak got its start with Grotius, his attempts to codify the laws of war. If soldiers had rights during war, then surely civilians did during peace. The power of the monarchy could finally start to be disputed. Grotius based his ideas on something called natural law, which held that human beings, because they were created by God, had rights, such as liberty, that could not be taken away. To do so would be to subvert God's will. Natural law was easy to circumvent, though, because the government or army could just consider the enemy to be subhuman, which happens naturally enough in war anyway. Christian and Muslim societies around the world clearly viewed themselves as superior to other faiths. Many tribal societies refer to themselves as the people, or the real people, generally classifying everyone else as barbarians, animals, or worse. The ancient Greek word for slave, andropodon, was derived from the word for cattle and essentially meant animals with human feet. Once you've dehumanized others to that degree, you don't have to worry about killing or enslaving God's people, because God's real children are supposedly limited to you and your tribe or clan. There are long-standing evolutionary origins for this bias. Our closest primate relatives, chimpanzees, occasionally kill a member of their own troop, but rarely commit desecration upon the body. When groups of males ambush and kill males of a rival troop, however, they often tear the victim's body to pieces, drinking his blood and tearing off strips of his flesh. According to primatologist Jane Goodall, they de-chimpize him by treating him like prey. Once the invading chimps have killed off all their male rivals, they mate with the females and incorporate them into their troop, much like the Yamnaya did in Iberia. It was not until the sweeping human rights laws of the 20th century that freedom stopped being a question of fighting off one's enemies. International treaties established mechanisms for imposing sanctions or even taking military actions against regimes that committed gross human rights violations. That made freedom a concern of virtually the entire world. Enshrining human rights as the apex of international law is one of the greatest achievements of Western society, perhaps greater than landing on the moon or decoding the human genome. But depends entirely on maintaining a delicate balance between national sovereignty and collective action. All it takes to destroy that balance is for one powerful nation, Hitler's Germany, for example, to decide they're better off doing whatever they want and suffer the consequences than abiding by the treaties. In the case of Germany, it almost worked. In 1604, the Ottoman Empire decided that the small, mountainous Principality of Montenegro had to be crushed. The Montenegrins were a famously warlike people who had always rejected any form of dominion and supposedly feared nothing except dying peacefully in bed. They inhabited a land that was too poor to support concentrations of people larger than a village. But these communities came together immediately when they were invaded. The men always kept a wool blanket over their shoulders to sleep in if need be, and dressed in a long cassock that was sashed around their waist and jammed full of weapons. They never went to war with anything less than a pistol, a musket, and a sword. The Ottoman invasion of Montenegro was a classic example of how a large army can be routed by a handful of determined locals. The Ottomans boasted 12,000 men, including cavalry and artillery, faced a mere 900 Montenegrins. The Montenegrins were unfazed and sent 3 men raiding parties out all night long before attacking at dawn, killing a third of the Ottoman army before the rest fled. The Ottomans invaded Montenegro several times over the next decade, each time more or less doubling the size of their army without ever achieving a lasting victory. After a major military defeat, the tribesmen simply operated in small guerrilla bands, observes anthropologist Christopher Boehm of Montenegrin defense strategy, by burning crops and hiding away livestock, by cutting off the enemy supply lines. They made certain that their rugged natural fortress could not be occupied permanently, except at an exorbitantly high cost. The Montenegrins lived a locally autonomous life while their neighbors remained in bondage. Across a broad range of species, chimpanzees, walruses, lions, elk, mice, large males and groups of males invariably win physical confrontations with each other. That is not the case with humans. It is a quality entirely unique to humans that a smaller entity, like the Montenegrins, could defeat a larger one. Were this not so, freedom would effectively be impossible. Every group would be run by a single large male. The world would be dominated by fascist megastates, like the Ottomans, could easily crush insubordinate populations. That's not what the world looks like. Large armies or people are stronger than small ones, but usually slower and less efficient. This is true at every scale, from open warfare to street corner fistfights. Because the outcome of any human conflict cannot be predicted with certainty, the powerful often end up having to negotiate with the weak, and those negotiations invariably revolve around freedom. Human violence reaches way back into our evolutionary past, usually about the same thing that are important to chimps: resources, territory, and sexual access to females. Because successful aggression rewards males with all those things, they tend to have more offspring than low-status males. The genetics of aggression become even more deeply encoded in the gene pool. Unlike chimps, bonobo groups are dominated by female alliances that are able to flourish in an environment that is blessed with plenty of food and no competition from mountain gorillas. Among chimps, fights with outsiders are lopsided ambushes that often result in death. But conflicts between males of the same troop are more balanced. The dominant male chimps bully almost everyone. When they attempt to bully each other, the larger and stronger male almost always forces the other to submit. That avoids all-out fights that could leave both combatants injured. Humans are exquisitely attuned to dominance for presumably the same reason. Body language and facial expression underlay a host of social interactions and are very effective at communicating important information about a person, particularly social rank. By assessing competency, people can predict with almost 70% accuracy winners of U.S. Senate races based on one single glimpse of the candidates' faces as they campaign. People can accurately assess dominant and submissive traits in others by seeing photographs of them for only 0.04 of a second, so-called thin-slice judgments. People who have no idea how to play basketball can detect which team is winning or losing by noticing unconscious dominant and submissive behaviors in the players during brief video clips. Men who score high on the dominance scale generally maintain a wide stance around others, square their shoulders, puff out their chest, hold their chin up, and generally take up as much room as possible. Submissive men do the opposite. Dominant men have significantly higher testosterone levels than non-dominant men, much lower levels of the stress hormone cortisol, both of which are associated with disease resistance and leadership. Testosterone is correlated so strongly with both aggression and wide facial structures in men, it's possible to predict roughly how much time a hockey player will spend in the penalty box during a season by measuring the width of his face. Winning a fight or athletic competition further boosts testosterone levels, which in turn make the dominant male more likely to win the next fight or competition. Unconscious submission is devastating to a person's chances of winning a fight. In pre-match publicity, boxers who allow themselves a small smile, a classic appeasement cue, are statistically less likely to win the fight than men who only frown. Such signals are known as leakage in the world of professional fighting. It's a sort of involuntary communication. It's deference. It's appeasement, says a former fighter and competitive weightlifter named Justin Master Chim Garcia, who trains people out of an old plumbing supply warehouse in the Bronx, New York. We want a fighting culture that strongly opposes leakage. The only time to communicate weakness is to manipulate. Only the weak mind adds suffering to circumstance. In addition to masking fear, a smaller fighter must keep his mind calm, his eyes open, and his heart rate steady. Think, look, and breathe. What we found is that endurance is the most important thing, says Chad Sonnen, a former wrestler and fighter who competes at 220 pounds. You want to fight the guy one weight class above you, because that's not enough to matter, but over the course of a fight, he's simply going to get tired faster. If you have an adversary that's larger than you automatically default in quickness, finesse, and endurance. As a result, human size and strength are not great predictors of who is going to win a fight. Street fights are harder to study because they happen so randomly. All of the fighting sports, boxing, karate, wrestling, grappling, are reasonable proxies for actual violence. In mixed martial arts, which integrates all forms of fighting into something that is probably very close to primordial combat, smaller fighters win about half the time against larger ones. Pre-reservation Apache believed that there was special wrestling power that could easily make up for small stature. A man can throw a man twice his size if he uses the power on him, an Apache warrior told anthropologist Grenville Goodwin in the 1930s. He does not do it by his strength at all, by his power. There is no name for this power at all, except that known to the man who has it. The reason size and strength do not absolutely determine outcome is that tactics play a huge role in human conflict. The central conundrum of fighting is that you cannot dominate your opponent without attacking him. But attacking ruins your defense and opens you up to counterattack. One classic defensive position comes from our most basic instincts: hands up to protect the face, chin down to protect the throat, arms in close to guard the torso. A child who's being tickled will naturally adopt an almost identical pose. In addition to leaving you momentarily vulnerable, attacking uses up a lot of energy. One good punch can end a fight. That punch can be slipped by something as subtle and efficient as the tilt of a head. 10 good punches in a row will leave even a trained fighter gasping for breath, while slipping them costs the other combatant almost nothing. When Manny Pacquiao fought Floyd Mayweather Jr. in a highly anticipated fight in Las Vegas in 2015, Pacquiao maintained a ferocious offense until halfway through the sixth round when he forced Mayweather against the ropes. Pacquiao unleashed 16 punches in a row, almost completely unopposed, with Mayweather blocking some, slipping others, and eating the rest. That seems to have been the turning point. Eventually, Pacquiao simply ran out of gas and took a step back, releasing Mayweather from the ropes. You can't hear it, but you can see it. Mayweather shaking his head and mouthing the word nope before starting his counterattack. Mayweather dominated the next 6 rounds and won the fight by unanimous decision. Mayweather and Pacquiao were the same size. The fight seemed to tip on the disproportionate energy cost of an offense compared to a defense. When it comes to a matchup between a smaller fighter and a larger one, each has a particular advantage. Large fighters are usually stronger and can outmuscle opponents if they get their hands on them. And small fighters have less mass to set into motion, so they can move faster and use less energy doing it. If fights were held in elevators or shower stalls, that wouldn't help much, but they're not. Even a 16-foot by 16-foot boxing ring can seem like acres of canvas with a fighter who really knows how to move. Large, aggressive men also tend to attack first. If they don't win quickly, they may not win at all. Strength does not increase linearly with body weight. The world record for the deadlift in the 148-pound weight class is just shy of 700 pounds, whereas the world record for the 308-pound weight class is 939 pounds. Doubling the weight class does not double how much a man can deadlift. In other words, it only increases the amount by about 25%. That's a dangerous trade-off because large muscles require more oxygen to function. If you're working so hard that you cannot replace that oxygen fast enough, you'll go into oxygen debt. Your vision will blur, your movements will slow, eventually you won't be able to stand up. At the same level of activity, all that will happen to a large person before a small one. In 1969, at the height of his powers, boxer Muhammad Ali was placed in front of a balsa wood board and told to smash it with one of his deadly jabs when a light flashed. His brain required only 15/100ths of a second to process the signal, much faster than the proverbial blink of an eye. But his fist was even faster. It snapped out and hit the board in 4/100ths of a second. Ali could also deliver a devastating 6-punch combination: 2 jabs, a hook, a right to the body, another hook, and then a right to the head in just over 2 seconds. If he was anything like some of the other top boxers who have been tested, his most powerful punches probably hit with as much as 1,000 pounds of force. It took 3 times as long for Ali's brain to process the flashing light than for his fist to react, which means that in a fight, his fist would easily hit his opponent's face before his opponent had a chance to move it. Neurologically, that should mean there's no way to slip a punch, which would turn fights into contests of pure punching power. But that's not what happens. The brain may be slow, but it's incredibly perceptive. The body may be fast, it's incredibly revealing. Long before the fist actually starts moving, the puncher's face and body emit a cascade of signals that reveal what is about to happen. Those signals are decoded by the opponent and used to begin slipping punches that haven't even happened yet. To pick up these cues, it helps to keep a kind of broad, general focus rather than fixating on your opponent's fists. The perceptive power of the brain in this undirected mode is so strong that it seems to border on a kind of telepathy. Test subjects can tell winning poker hands, for example, by watching 2-second clips of professional players moving their chips to the center of the table to place a bet. Players with winning hands were almost imperceptibly smoother and looser in their body movements. The faces were unobservable in this study. A separate study found that facial expression, which is easy to mask, did not help observers judge the strength of a hand at all. The same is true of athletes. If you show basketball players a brief video of fellow players taking a free throw, roughly 2/3 of the time they can determine whether or not he will make the shot based solely on the movement of the arm. There's something about grace that tells athletes what is about to happen. In short, quicker, more efficient movements give small fighters an advantage over large ones, and unconscious perceptions allow them to see punches before they've been launched. Were either not true, large fighters would regularly crush small ones, but they don't. This allows humans to confront or disobey the largest male in the group, which is a departure from millions of years of primate evolution. In addition, the invention of weapons served to greatly equalize size differences between combatants. The possession by all men of the means to kill secretly anyone perceived as a threat to their own well-being not only limits predation and exploitation, also serves as a powerful leveling mechanism, observed anthropologist James Woodburn about the nomadic Hadza of East Africa. Inequalities of wealth, power, and prestige are potential sources of envy and resentment and can be dangerous for the holders. And the basic dynamics of asymmetrical conflict readily scale up. Insurgents like the Montenegrins cannot hope to beat a large conventional military in open combat, so they don't even try. They avoid standing toe-to-toe and trading blows. They strike only when they can get away. Conventional armies burn through more fuel, munitions, and food in the same way that large fighters burn through more oxygen, and even wealthy nations can't afford to maintain that level of effort indefinitely. The logistical demands of a modern mechanized army are so enormous that most of its resources go into simply sustaining itself. No more than 1/3 of its soldiers are directly engaged in combat, and usually far less. Insurgents, on the other hand, are almost all engaged in combat, often including senior commanders, and they never have to win, they just have to keep not losing. Air power is also of limited value against smaller forces. In fact, there's almost an inversion of ordinary military principles. The fewer enemy there are, the harder they are to kill and less likely they are to be defeated. A 1,000,000-man army can probably be destroyed faster than a 1,000-man insurgency because it is completely dependent on command hierarchy and resupply. Destroy those things and there is no army. Most insurgencies, on the other hand, are composed of semi-autonomous cells that are dependent on the society they live in, and targeting civilians is a war crime. It also turns the populace against the invaders and drives them into the arms of the insurgents. Bombers and attack aircraft can drop devastating munitions on the battlefield. They're easy for insurgents to avoid and incredibly costly to operate. There does not seem to be enough jet fuel in the world to keep enough aircraft aloft to kill all the people who are willing to die fighting them. Air power alone has never broken an insurgency, and reliance on it can almost be considered a sign of strategic failure. On the ground, combat soldiers in the U.S. military carry loads of up to 140 pounds on approach marches and 70 or 80 pounds in combat, including a 30-pound ballistic vest that traps heat, sends body temperature soaring. Machine gunners and ammo bearers routinely carry a lot more than that. The weight is a problem in hot weather, when soldiers require as much as 2 or 3 gallons of water a day to avoid dehydration and heat stroke. According to the Asymmetrical Warfare Group, AWG, an elite high-mobility unit within the U.S. military, soldiers are often reduced to maneuver speeds of 1 or 2 miles an hour by such loads, yet they are fighting insurgents who can move several times as fast. The result is that Western troops struggle to corner and defeat even lightly armed insurgents. The parallel between current-day Taliban forces in Afghanistan and the Apache of the 1860s and 70s is so obvious that the School of Advanced Military Studies at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, has published a monograph on the Indian Wars. The failed subjugation attempts assisted the Apache to develop a warrior culture based on resistance and survival through tactical action, notes the author Major Stephen Snyder, a former AWG commander. The Apache created a warrior that was an expert at fighting in austere environments, understood the use of irregular tactics to render a numerically superior force vulnerable, and possessed an intrinsic warrior ideology that defeated all previous foreign invaders. After 2 decades of war in Afghanistan, the United States found itself having to negotiate with an insurgency that lacked air power, tanks, heavy artillery, and sometimes even boots. A relatively small number of Taliban insurgents fought the most powerful military in the world to a standstill, and a prior generation of Afghans did the same thing to the former Soviet Union. The Taliban represent an oppressive ideology that has almost no respect for human rights, but many insurgencies are fighting for those rights. If all insurgencies and uprisings were easily crushed, there would be no possibility for political change or freedom in the world. Among other outcomes, the United States would not exist. However it is defined, freedom is due in part to the fact that powerful nations do not always win wars, and powerful men do not always win fights. In fact, as often as not, they lose. Book 3, Think. The central problem for human freedom is that groups that are well organized enough to defend themselves against others are well organized enough to oppress their own. Power is so readily abused that one can almost say that its concentration is antithetical to freedom. Democracy, both in its modern form and its original indigenous form, is an attempt to balance the two. The Iroquois Great Law of Peace, for example, was established generations before whites arrived in North America and served as a philosophical starting point for the U.S. Constitution. In both Western and Native traditions, a warrior culture was fostered that could defend the tribe or nation that was under the direct control of civilians. And civilians had to be willing to give up leadership when they were overruled by a majority, because they presumably valued having no power in a fair system more than they valued having all the power in an unfair one. The great virtue of hunter-gatherer societies around the world was that, although leaders understandably had more prestige than other people, they didn't have more rights. Unlike European monarchs, they could not leverage their power to gain access to wealth and resources. They could not skirt the rules and laws that governed everybody else. Christianity was a high moral system based on the preaching of a destitute ascetic, but it somehow became the dominant faith of a medieval society where kings could commit murder without consequences, the powerful could rape, steal, and plunder even among their own. As late as 1936, a Spanish aristocrat named Gonzalo de Aguilera y Monroe lined up the laborers on his estate outside Salamanca and executed 6 of them at random to discourage the rest from demanding better working conditions. Not only was he never charged with the crime, he boasted about it publicly under the new fascist regime in Spain. Far from acting as an impediment to abuse, The church was often allied with aristocrats like Aguilera, participating in military campaigns during the Middle Ages, and even torturing and killing perceived enemies. The only advocate for the poor seemed to be Jesus, but century after century, the poor just seemed to stay poor. At the very least, this bizarre system required a kind of martial fortitude on the part of the powerful. Kings were expected to lead their armies in person, which put them in the midst of a kind of hacking slaughter that clearly spared no one. That could qualify as a kind of rough egalitarianism. The last European monarch to die in combat was King James IV of Scotland, who invaded England in 1513 with 30,000 soldiers, noblemen, and clergy. He saw a third of his force annihilated before he himself was cut down. Almost 30 years earlier, King Richard III of England had been unhorsed and killed at Bosworth Field. After those battles, the kingly virtue of fighting alongside noblemen and commoners began to die out, and monarchs were content to order other men to do their fighting and dying for them. There's obviously little merit in having leaders of modern democracies do the work of combat infantry. Even lieutenant colonels don't do that unless absolutely necessary. It doesn't mean sacrifice need disappear from public life. In a deeply free society, not only would leaders be barred from exploiting their position, they would also be expected to make the same sacrifices and accept the same punishments as everyone else. The authors of the American Constitution were among the wealthiest and most powerful men of their society, and yet, with a few narrow exceptions, they made themselves subject to the same laws and penalties that governed others. Many also risked being hanged for treason if the British won the war. It's one of the few times in recorded history that a society's elite stripped themselves of special protections offered to serve the populace rather than demanding to be served by them. Although democracy may not survive as a broad form of freedom, its core virtue of insisting leaders be accountable to others, willing to make sacrifices, is crucial to any group that faces adversity. In that, democracy has essentially reproduced hunter-gatherer societies, where rigid constraints are put on leaders because self-serving leaders can literally get people killed. But in any society, leaders who aren't willing to make sacrifices aren't leaders. They're opportunists. And opportunists rarely have the common good in mind. They're easy to spot, though. Opportunists lie reflexively, blame others for failures, and are unapologetic cowards. Wealthy nations might survive that kind of leadership, but insurgencies and uprisings probably won't. Their margins simply aren't big enough. The prerequisite for any such group would seem to be leaders that, like their followers, are prepared to die for the cause. Hunter-gatherers are generally spared opportunistic leadership because the gap between rich and poor is so narrow, not surprising in economies that don't use currency or stockpile food. As soon as food can be monopolized, though, hunter-gatherers become just as unfair and stratified as everyone else. Archaeological evidence from across the Pacific Northwest indicates that some native communities figured out how to restrict access to riverine salmon fisheries and quickly instituted a powerful elite that built large houses, kept slaves, passed wealth from generation to generation. But most native peoples lived off the land in a way that could not be monopolized. A survey of several hundred tribes native to North America found that nearly 90% of the ones with no large food surpluses also had no political inequality. Conversely, social stratification was found in almost 90% of tribes that did stockpile food or monopolize its production. And even at the subsistence level, hunter-gatherers often go to great lengths to make sure skilled hunters are not held in overly high esteem. It's not that they are against excellence. In fact, they depend on it. They know how badly pride and ego can destabilize a group. A Hasdo returning to camp having shot a large animal is expected to exercise restraint, observed anthropologist James Woodburn. He sits down quietly with the other men, allows the blood on his arrow shaft to speak for him. The distribution of income in a society is called the Gini coefficient, named after an Italian sociologist named Corrado Gini, who published a paper on the topic in 1912. A society where one person earns all the money and everyone else earns none effectively has a Gini coefficient of 1, and a society where everybody earns the same amount has a coefficient of 0. Neither is desirable. Moderate differences in income motivate people because they have a reasonable chance of bettering their circumstances, and extreme differences discourage people because their efforts look futile. A study of 21 small-scale societies around the world found that hunter-gatherers like the Hadza, who presumably represent the most efficient possible system for survival in a hostile environment, have Gini coefficients as low as 0.25. In other words, they are far closer to absolute income equality than to absolute monopoly. Because oppression from one's own leaders is as common a threat as oppression from one's enemies, Gini coefficients are one reliable measure of freedom. Hunter-gatherer societies are not democracies. Many hold women in subordinate family roles. But the relationship between those families and their leaders is almost impervious to exploitation. In that sense, they're freer than virtually all modern societies. According to multiple sources, including the Congressional Budget Office, the United States has one of the highest Gini coefficients of the developed world, 0.42, which puts it roughly the level of ancient Rome. Before taxes, the American Gini coefficient is even higher, almost 0.6, which is on par with the deeply corrupt countries like Haiti, Namibia, and Botswana. Moreover, the wealth gap between America's richest and poorest families has doubled since 1989. Globally, the situation is even more extreme. Several dozen extremely rich people control as much wealth as the bottom half of humanity, 3.8 billion people. It's tempting to imagine that economic injustice destabilizes societies to the point where they collapse and have to reform themselves, but the opposite appears to be true. Countries with large income disparities, such as the United States, are among the most powerful and wealthy countries in the world, perhaps because they can protect themselves with robust economies and huge militaries. They're just not very free. Even societies with income disparities that are truly off the chart, medieval Europe had a Gini coefficient of 0.79, are relatively stable until a cataclysmic event, like the plague, triggers a radical redistribution of wealth. During the last decades, progressive reforms have reduced the Gini coefficient and stabilized the economies in many Latin American countries. From every standpoint, morally, politically, economically, such reforms are clearly the right thing to do. But throughout the great sweep of human history, egalitarian societies with low Gini coefficients rarely dominate world events. From the Han Dynasty of ancient China to the Roman Empire to the United States, there seems to be a sweet spot of economic injustice that is moderately unfair to most of its citizens, but produces extremely powerful societies. Economist Walter Scheidel calculates that 3,500 years ago, with large-scale states controlled only 1% of the Earth's habitable landmass, but represented at least half the human population. By virtually any metric, that's a successful society. For thousands of years, most of humanity lived in the shadow of these giants, Scheidel writes. This is the environment that created the original 1%, made up of competing but often closely intertwined elite groups. The question then is, how do ordinary people protect their freedom in the face of such highly centralized state control? Before dawn on May 8, 1916, an Irish revolutionary named Michael Mallon was led down a flight of stairs into a small courtyard known as the Stonebreaker's Yard at Dublin's infamous Kilmainham jail. Mallon was 41 years old, father of four, organizer for the Dublin Silk Weavers Union. He was also second in command of the Irish Citizen Army, which is one of the revolutionary groups that had hoped to overthrow British rule in Ireland. Mallon had been given command of a brigade and told to take over St. Stephen's Green, which he did with a group of men and women armed with everything from bird-hunting guns to Mauser machine pistols. Mallon's forces dug trenches and set up a kitchen and first aid station before being driven out by British soldiers shooting down from the surrounding buildings. The combat was intense, but would pause for an old man to come and feed the park's ducks every day. The Easter Rising, as it was known, had at times the odd feeling of street performance or make-believe. Many of the combatants knew each other, and civilians would gather to watch pitched battles as if they were football matches. One brigade went to their positions on the city tram carrying pikes, shotguns, and machine guns like revelers on Halloween. Their commander insisted on paying everyone's fare. Another group was offended when a policeman laughed at the sight of them and accused them of playing soldier. And then a city hall clerk and theater actor named Sean Connolly shot an unarmed policeman in the head, and there was no going back. The policeman's name was James O'Brien. He was a longtime veteran of the city police force who was guarding Dublin's Castle Gate. A group of armed, uniformed rebels had surprised all of Dublin on Easter morning by massing at the Castle Gate. O'Brien raised his arm to stop them from passing. Connolly, who would be dead from a sniper's bullet within hours, raised his rifle and shot O'Brien point blank. O'Brien stood for a moment and then dropped to the ground, geysering blood from his head. The rebels gaped in amazement at what they had done, and then rushed forward. The rebels were mostly working-class men from Dublin, with a smattering of writers and poets among the leaders. There was a women's brigade as well. The women scattered throughout the brigades, many of them wives and mothers of men who were fighting. The bullets were often handmade, and the grenades were fashioned from tin cans stuffed with nuts, bolts, and an explosive called gelignite. Many rebels carried Lee Enfield 303s that had been lifted from British soldiers who spent their nights drinking in the city pubs. Others had old Mauser 71s that kicked so badly they threw people's shoulders out and spewed 3 feet of flame out of the muzzle. The rebels mustered at half strength, if that, knew so little about urban combat, they dispatched someone to Dublin Library to look it up. They hated the English enough to invite the Germans to invade Ireland on their behalf, but the Germans had their hands full on the battlefields of Europe, sent a shipload of weapons instead. The British Navy made sure it never reached shore. The British troops had minimal training as well. It may be testament to the efficacy of modern weapons that the two sides still achieved such slaughter. Advancing in waves up Northumberland Road, a force of mostly teenage boys in British uniform ran straight into machine gun fire from 17 rebels holed up in buildings around Mount Street Bridge. There were several ways to bypass this bottleneck, but the British command seemed intent on proving a point. British forces eventually took the bridge by simply sending teenagers in faster than the rebels could shoot them. By the time it was over, more than 200 English boys lay dead or dying on Northumberland Road along the banks of the canal. Many were crumpled in doorways where they had tried to take cover. The rebels lost 5 men. Elsewhere in the city, looters swarmed through the streets and briefly gave both sides a common enemy. Street children took over a hatter's shop and came out dressed in rags but wearing hunting caps and bowlers. Drunks ransacked a waxworks and came out in period costume to do battle on the streets with swords and broken bottles. The mayhem did not endear the rebels to the populace. Groups of working-class women, many of whom had sons and husbands in the trenches of France, began to gather in mobs and scream obscenities. Later, after it was all over, many of these same women urged British troops to bayonet them when prisoners were rounded up and marched down the street. Although the real struggle would come later, an initial British victory was almost inevitable. They had artillery, heavy machine guns, battle wagons made from old locomotive boilers that carried troops who shot through gun loops. A battleship fired her cannon from the harbor, and reinforcements poured in by the day. When the British couldn't get close to the rebels, they shelled them. When they couldn't shell them, they starved them. By the end of the week, the rebels were so exhausted that some had to be carried asleep to new positions as they retreated. After 6 days, the rebels agreed to unconditional surrender and were marched from their positions at gunpoint. Thousands of rebels and ordinary citizens were detained. 14 leaders stood trial for treason. Michael Mallon was one of them. His trial lasted 15 minutes. It was conducted by military personnel who had little, if any, legal training. There was no jury or stenographer or public witness. Mallon was allowed no legal counsel. He was found guilty of treason and sentenced to death by firing squad. Given the opportunity to speak, he simply said that he wanted to thank Captain Harry de Courcy-Wheeler, to whom he had surrendered, for the kindness and consideration that he has shown us during that time. Mallon was driven from the military barracks where the trial was held to Kilmainham jail, where he would be executed. The route happened to pass his house. Mallon managed to catch sight of his dog in the yard as he went by. 2 nights later, hours before his execution, he wrote a letter to his wife. It was mostly stream of consciousness and seemed seized by regret that he was abandoning her and their children. My heartstrings are torn to pieces when I think of you, and then of our manly James, happy-go-lucky John, shy, warm Una, daddy's girl, oh little Joseph, my little man. Wife, dear wife, I cannot keep the tears back when I think of him. He will rest in my arms no more. My little man, my little man, my little man. His name unnerves me again. All your dear faces arise before me. God bless you. God bless you, my darlings. Now the sound of the lock bolt, the groan of the hinges. Now Mallon descending the staircase at the stonebreaker's yard. It's barely light, and he will never see the sun again, nor his home, nor his family. Mallon has sat on a crate against a stone wall that is already chipped from previous volleys. A piece of paper is pinned to his chest to give the rifleman something to shoot at. A medical examiner will later say that the soldiers were more nervous than the condemned, and that their rifles waved like a field of corn when they took aim. Mallon is offered a blindfold, but it is not known if he accepts. Moments later, he is dead. On the face of it, the idea that given enough time, an impoverished agrarian society could face down a global power 50 miles off their coast seems improbable. In fact, Irish separatists embodied every single trait common to successful insurgencies around the world. If anything, the long-term odds might seem slightly in their favor. Anyone who wants to overthrow an established power, a government, an army, or even a dominant corporation, must first and foremost believe they are fulfilling a kind of historic destiny. People like Michael Mallon need a reason to think their sacrifice was worth it when they hug their children for the last time. And Irish history provides that in spades. Centuries of British rule gave them a clear sense of heroic sacrifice, and the potato famine of the 1840s, which killed or displaced a quarter of the population, turned Ireland into a land of almost mythic suffering. Those attributes were amplified by Irish music and literature during a decades-long cultural awakening that led up to the Easter Rising, and Gaelic was resurrected as a source of national pride in direct defiance of British law. And many of the insurgents were Catholic, which made independence from Protestant England almost a divine cause. While most people will defend their families without a second thought, dying for an idea usually requires giving ordinary people an extraordinary sense of purpose, and both national suffering and God do that nicely. None of that will help, though, if leaders aren't prepared to make huge sacrifices as well. An insurgency or political movement with leaders who refuse to suffer the same consequences as everyone else is probably doomed. Unfair hierarchies destroy motivation, and motivation is the one thing that underdogs must have more than everyone else. Like the American men who signed the Declaration of Independence, Irish separatist leaders must have known that losing to Britain would almost certainly mean their execution for treason. After all, the British still executed their own soldiers for cowardice. What is startling, however, is the level of risk these men tolerated during actual combat. Irish leaders made little distinction between themselves and the soldiers they led. If anything, they sometimes showed a kind of flagrant disregard for their own safety. James Connolly, commander-in-chief of rebel forces in Dublin, took no notice of rank, according to one of his men, and insisted on touring frontline positions in person. His main weakness was an almost pathological cheerfulness under fire. Heavy firing was taking place, and Connolly insisted on walking out into Abbey Street, giving me instructions as to where I should place a barricade, remembers a 17-year-old fighter named Oscar Traynor, who would go on to serve as Ireland's longest-running Minister of Defense. Bullets were actually striking the pavement around us. I pointed this out to him and said I thought it was a grave risk, that these instructions could be given inside. Connolly was wounded twice that week, including by a bullet that destroyed his ankle. As a result, he was the only man who was not able to walk to his own execution. Soldiers carried him into the stonebreaker's yard, fired a volley into his chest that also blew out the back of the chair he was tied to. Women are the final components of defeating a dominant power. First and foremost, they impart a kind of moral legitimacy to protests that could otherwise be dismissed as simple mayhem. Unlike small men in a fistfight, they're often underestimated in ways that can be endlessly exploited against an overconfident adversary. During the 1912 mill strike in Lawrence, Massachusetts, for example, immigrant women stood directly in front of National Guard troops and mocked their manhood, despite the fact that they had bayonets pointed directly at their bellies. One policeman can handle 10 men, a frustrated city official complained, while it takes 10 policemen to handle one woman. The Lawrence Mill strike occurred during an exceptionally undemocratic time in America, when thousands of immigrants stopped working to protest living conditions that saw almost 1 in 5 infants die before the age of 2. Rather than help reform the textile industry, state and federal government cracked down on the protesters. Among other things, they tried to ban midwifery because they were alarmed, so well they might have been, by the idea of women providing crucial skills and services outside of state control. The men who were marching in the street were easily stopped by troops with guns, but the women were almost entirely beyond scrutiny. They established kitchens to feed the strikers, befriended soldiers and court officials in order to spy on them, and frisked suspicious men to make sure they weren't scabs. Women's belief in the public nature of individual misfortune, historian Ardis Cameron has written, helped women mold grievances into specific targets of protest. In the end, the strikers won. Immigrant women were effective precisely because they were marginal. Their social networks ran laterally through overpopulated neighborhoods that were almost impossible to infiltrate, and They emphasized the interconnectedness of individual lives, as Cameron observes, in ways that serve to unify disparate groups. Hierarchical male groups are good at mustering on the streets and running into gunfire. Another important task. They're terrible at creating alliances. According to Big Bill Haywood, the most notorious of the labor leaders, it was the women who won the strike. In pitched battles, bullets don't distinguish between the sexes, but policemen often do. Rightly or wrongly, society tends to value women's survival more than men's. That makes machine gunning them problematic. A British investigation into the loss of the Titanic found that men died at much higher rates than women, and that men in first-class cabins had some of the highest mortality rates on the ship, even higher than female crew. If millionaires on sinking ships are willing to give their lifeboat seats to working-class women they don't even know, soldiers are going to balk at opening fire on women in the street. Not that it doesn't happen, but such slaughter is greeted with far more international outrage than the mass killing of men. And commanders who give such orders risk triggering a revolt against among their own troops. In military terminology, that makes women a force multiplier, a factor that allows soldiers to fight more effectively than another unit of the same size. The lone female separatist who was sentenced to death during the Easter Rising, Constance Markievicz, had her sentence commuted because the British were worried about the political consequences. That can be used in countless ways to flummox even a government that doesn't balk at losing nearly 60,000 men in a single day. 7 years after the successful Lawrence strike, steelworkers called for a general strike in the mill towns around Pittsburgh. Most of the workers were immigrants from Central Europe. They had a hard time even understanding English, much less taking on the U.S. government. They also had to deal with troopers on horseback who rode right up people's front steps into their houses, and a private security force called the Coal and Iron Police. A journalist named Mary Heaton Vorse, who had covered the Lawrence strike for Harper's Weekly, was now working for a church-sponsored fact-finding mission, traveled by train to Pittsburgh to see if the workers could do it again. Vorse also covered combat during the First World War, and raised 3 children on a writer's income after her second husband died in 1915. Vorse had particularly good access to the women in the mill towns. Her account makes it clear that even when they were not protesting in the streets, their work taking care of their families was definitely crucial to the cause. The endurance of women was a bulwark of the steel strike, she writes. Young and burdened down by the cares of their children, the women upheld it. There were hundreds of women, and thousands of them scattered through the steel towns, who made up their minds that they could hold out a little longer, another week, 2 weeks more. The mill workers were striking for fair pay, shorter hours, and less dangerous conditions. Some mills averaged a fatality a day. The strike also went to the heart of fundamental American rights. Pressured by the steel companies, local governments banned all labor meetings and even made it a crime to gather in groups of more than 2 in public. These local ordinances were so severe that the mayor of Duquesne, Pennsylvania, boasted that Jesus Christ himself couldn't speak in his town. 5,000 men were deputized by the Allegheny County Sheriff, a man named Haddock, given firearms that the steel companies had bought for them. Mounted troops, known locally as Cossacks, were dispatched to the mill towns, began arresting people based on tips from undercover agents who worked for the steel companies. A Senate investigation later found that among hundreds of transgressions, the police had arrested a woman just for going to the store to get food for her family. They also beat and arrested a man, an American citizen, who was standing in his own doorway looking. The police seemed to want a level of obedience from people that bordered on civility. That was precisely the kind of feudal state many of the steelworkers had fled in the first place. The Slovaks, Poles, Russians, and Hungarians who worked in the steel mills of Pennsylvania may have not realized it. They were as much standing up for fundamental American rights of free speech and assembly as they were for their own personal interests. The strike swept through the country like a flame, wrote Vorse. 300,000 people thinking the same thing. 20 nationalities striking for the same reason. Over the wide expanse of this country, one could see the most dramatic thing in the world, hundreds of thousands of patient men staying home. Small labor unions across the country voted to donate a day's pays to the cause. A special milk fund was set up in Pittsburgh to feed babies that were born during the strike. The Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America sent $100,000, but in the end, it didn't work. The steel industry was too powerful, the uninterrupted production of steel too essential. The government was just not sufficiently interested in democratic freedoms, at least not if economic interests were at stake. The police put machine guns at the intersections and broke up everything from basement meetings to funerals. In the end, the workers went back to work. 14 years later, Congress would pass laws that protected freedom of assembly for workers, eventually collective bargaining rights for labor unions. Later, protest movements would depend on those same First Amendment rights to advance their own causes. Democracy won, which is to say that a form of freedom had won. It was not literally fought for, that part had already happened, but it was thought for. It was arrived at through a rational process that came to the conclusion that all humans are free and equal, and no amount of money or power can change that. Putting that principle into practice would be another matter, but at least the words were written down for the whole world to see. At the heart of most stable governments is a willingness to share power with people you disagree with, and may even hate. That is true for small-scale societies like the Apache and Iroquois, as well as for large-scale democracies like the United States. When American legislators granted unions the right to bargain as equals with the heads of industry, they were effectively saying that the people who owned the machines would have to start sharing power with the people who ran them, and that values like fairness and human dignity were going to determine at least some of the rules of the game. If democratic power sharing is a potent form of freedom, accepting an election loss may be the ultimate demonstration of how free you want to be. History is littered with fascist leaders who have rigged elections and tortured or killed critics, but their regimes were remarkably short-lived, especially considering the obsession these men usually have with holding power. Many wind up dead or in prison. Almost none leave behind stable regimes. Even China, a rare example of a thriving country with an oppressive government, was severely destabilized by the protests at Tiananmen Square in 1989. The government paid a huge political and economic price for the resulting massacre and cover-up. Western democracies, on the other hand, are among the most enduring and prosperous political systems in history. They seem to be able to transfer power almost indefinitely, which further bolsters their economies and cements their alliances. What Mary Heaton Vorse witnessed in the steel towns around Pittsburgh in 1919 was a democracy starting to decide how much to constrain its most powerful members, which is a question that every society must answer if it wants to be successful and free. Everything is in steel, the steelworker told Vorse when she asked him what it contained. There's naught you wouldn't find in steel. She might as well have been asking about democracy itself. Going through Bolivar, the tracks sat a high embankment that must have served as a levee to protect the town from floods. We pulled ourselves up the slope through slash left by a brush-cutting crew, moved west under rain so warm we could have just laid down in it and gone to sleep. The weather moved out overnight, and the next morning the sun steamed the moisture out of the top ballast. We walked west into our shadows with the track bed smoking under our feet. We walked out of the Conemaugh, and the tracks bent due south. Railroad rights-of-ways are often 200 yards from tree line to tree line, so north-south stretches have no shade at all. It was hot. We were stopping every 30 minutes to drink a quart of water each, sweating too hard to even roll a cigarette because they wouldn't light. A passenger train came by on so suddenly that we just sat down holding the dog, watched the faces in the windows click-clack past. The engineer rode the long, compressed outrage of his air horn all the way in until the bottom dropped out and the whole hurtling contrivance rattled and shuddered out of view. We walked into the town of Derry and ate burgers at a bar-top joint named Smitty's, and Smitty himself came out to see what we were about. He saw our dog and our packs and said more rain was coming. There was an abandoned trailer on the tracks west of town where we could spend the night. Guy in town lost his job and stayed out there all winter, no problem, Smitty said. It's warm now. I don't believe anyone's out there. The trailer was a moldering ruin that we just opened the door to and shut again. Nearby was some kind of prefab railroad asset that had a little porch and a stack of shallow wooden crates containing soil core samples. Rainstorms rattled through all night. Next day we passed La Robe on elevated tracks with the sun thundering down, the town klaxons howling. It wasn't noon and we didn't hear fire engines, so all I could think of was that the alarm was for us. We sat up under the shade of an overpass and watched down track, but no one came for us, so we moved on. The dog was stunned with the heat, and the men were silent as they walked. You have to put your mind in one room and your body in another. Just don't let them talk, I thought. That way, the more you hurt, the less you feel. A man standing outside some kind of gasworks saw us and shouted it was raining 2 towns away and that we'd be getting that soon. A few miles later, an antiquated train rocked past with nicely painted trim brass hardware on her doors. The caboose had a large viewing window. rows of rearward-facing seats that were filled with well-dressed people who gaped at us and were gone. Half an hour later, a white Jeep rolled up. The man wearing a white button-down shirt lowered his window and stuck out his head. We'd heard tires on the gravel, too late to hide. We were too hot to care anyway. The train that just went by had the CEO of the rail company and his wife and friends on board, he said. The man looked like private security. There were too many of us for him to arrest, but that didn't mean there wasn't more trouble coming. He called you guys in for trespassing, and the police are on their way. Another pause. If I were you, I'd just kind of step into the woods for a bit. We thanked him and retreated into the trees, but the cops never came, so we moved on. We walked straight down Greensburg's main street, deserted in the midday heat, and soon we were back on the tracks. A teenage girl at a grade crossing locked her car doors we trooped past. We're walking through 110-degree heat index, and I'm sure it wasn't hard to think that if we were willing to do that, we might be willing to do anything. At Greensburg and at Scottdale and at Hunker, word must have spread that some madmen were coming because a lady said she'd already heard about us, and a Vietnam vet whose property backed onto the tracks waved us in to fill our bottles in his kitchen. We weren't on high-speed line anymore, but rather some kind of freight route where no one gave a damn who we were or what we were doing. The cross ties were rotted, and the rails were warped. When freights crawled by, their loads swayed so badly we seriously considered whether the whole thing was just going to tip. We pushed on to a stretch of clean water called Jacob's Creek, climbed a hill through some fir and pine to a stacked log deer blind that was nestled into a rock outcropping, held a clear survey of the creek and anything that might come up from that direction, and we made camp there with the thick orange sun settling behind us into a hay meadow that was already draft yellow in the heat. We were heading for a town called Connellsville, on the Youghiogheny River, 50 miles outside Pittsburgh. Force wrote that the river ran red from the glare of the coke furnaces that burned nonstop. Now the town was deserted, as if a great army had fought from there and then decamped overnight. People in Connellsville swim in the river because they don't have pools, a woman told us. In the middle of downtown, she added. Swimming in downtown Connellsville sounded good. Finding a place to sleep would be easy in a town that poor. We had another reason to go there, though. In 1754, a young lieutenant named George Washington was dispatched by the British to monitor French movements in that area. Both nations were vying for control of the Ohio River Valley, and that meant establishing a presence in western Pennsylvania. Washington commanded a small detachment of colonial troops, a dozen Mingo scouts who were under the leadership of a chief known as Half King. On a rainy night in late May, Half King and his warriors led Washington on through the woods to the enemy camp, which was concealed from view at the foot of a small rock outcrop. Washington and his men quietly encircled the camp and attacked at first light, killing 9 Canadian soldiers before their commander surrendered. His name was Joseph Coulon de Jumonville, and the incident may never have been remembered, except that by many accounts the Half-King ran forward and buried his tomahawk in the back of Jumonville's head. That started a series of escalations and reprisals that culminated in what is known as the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War. Not only was it the first global conflict, it was the bloodiest 9 years in the entire blood-soaked history of the Pennsylvania frontier. We made Connellsville late in the day and sat on the river cobble watching people wade into the water. Some just stood at their waists in the great heat, and others swam. A couple of children floated on rafts. Iron trestles shot across the river, too rusted and broken to walk on, though I'm sure some have tried. The rain and heat had turned the bottoms of my feet into something like oatmeal. When I took my boots off, my socks were pink with blood. The battlefield was 10 or 15 miles away, a day's walk, over a steep ridge south of town. Our plan was to walk through the woods and stop just short of the battle site. After dark, we'd creep in like Washington had, roll our sleeping bags out under the cliff. It was possible that no one had slept there since the French. We'd leave before the park rangers opened up in the morning and head for Wheeling, West Virginia, 2 days away. Then we'd be at the Ohio. Anything was possible after that. The Ohio was the gateway to the rest of the continent. The Ohio was the gateway to everything. I got up to try my feet out, but I couldn't even stand normally, much less walk. We weren't going to the battlefield. We weren't going anywhere. The trip was over. I was 51 years old. I had no children, and I was in the process of getting divorced. In 400 miles, I'd never mentioned that to the other men, and they had never brought it up. Another man was also getting divorced, but he had never mentioned it either. The trip was an escape from that, a temporary injunction against whatever was coming. But a few times in your life, you arrive at a place where your future has been waiting for you all along. Connellsville was that place for me. It was time to go home. It was time to face my life. The Delaware and Seneca had swum at this spot, and the settlers and the steelworkers are now us. I limped to the river and sank into the water. It smelled like iron and mud. I surfaced and looked around. The train trestle, the children, the friends at my back. I went under one more time, and when I came up, I made my way carefully back to shore. Epilogue. The last 5 minutes. On January 6, 2021, thousands of Trump supporters stormed the U.S. Capitol to stop Joe Biden from becoming president. The movement's leaders claimed their freedom had been stolen because their candidate, Donald Trump, had lost the election. Any book about freedom would seem to have to address such a gross misuse of the word, such a close call for the world's oldest democracy. The best comparison for what happened in Washington that day might be the run-up to the Spanish Civil War, when a democratic election was overturned by a coalition of authoritarian factions that refused to accept defeat. In fact, the rise of fascism in Spain is a virtual blueprint for how to destroy a democracy. It's tracked so closely with the 2020 election, it's hard not to wonder whether some of Trump's advisors actually studied it. My father, Miguel, was born in Germany in 1923, moved to Spain when he was 10. One hot July summer morning, 3 years later, he and his family were woken up by machine gun fire in the streets of Madrid. The Popular Front had just swept the national elections. General Francisco Franco and the rest of the Spanish right wing were determined to stop it. Franco's military allies quickly seized Madrid's Montana barracks. The gunfire my father heard that morning was government forces laying siege to the building. A right-wing general had falsely claimed that the national election had been stolen. Hundreds of young fascists were willing to die defending a lie. Election fraud was the only explanation they had for how a coalition of Jews, communists, and feminists could take over a Christian country. When people like Franco take your freedom, they may well start by taking your reality. The Montana barracks were recaptured within days. Franco's forces quickly gained ground elsewhere. Franco declared himself to be the only person who could save Spain from dishonor and ruin, and launched a national campaign in defense of Western civilization and against communist barbarism, quote-unquote. In a dizzying inversion, Francoist courts declared that it was the government, not the insurrectionists, who had betrayed Spain. Supporting the government was illegal. The penalty, of course, was death. The rebellion, we planned it the day we lost the election, one fascist leader admitted to the American consul in Madrid. Fascism is a form of government that relies on violence and nationalistic rhetoric to maintain power. Fascists demonize their enemies, arrest or kill their critics, glorify their supporters, and appeal to religious leaders to legitimize their rule. It is the exact opposite of freedom. Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State are just as fascistic as Stalin's Russia or Hitler's Germany. When I asked my father why he and his family fled Spain, he simply said, because of the fascists. He always spat out the word as if he didn't want it in his mouth any longer than necessary. According to him, fascists want power, not freedom. They want obedience, not loyalty. They want faith, not knowledge. They are the exact opposite of everything that is good and noble about America, which was the country that eventually took my father in. Fortunately, fascists seem to take power easily, have a hard time holding it. Every fascist or communist state in Europe became a democracy pretty much as soon as it was given the chance. Many of their leaders were tried and executed. As Czech President Tomáš Masaryk observed during the build-up to World War II, dictators always look good into their last 5 minutes. Fascism's rough opposite, democracy, is wildly appealing to people around the world because its purpose, the very point of its existence, is to safeguard the rights of individuals. That means that pretty much everyone gets a vote. Minorities are protected from majority abuse. Even the most powerful people in the country are bound by the same laws as everyone else. America has failed that high standard over and over, but it is also capable of extraordinary fairness. In 2004, an enemy combatant captured in Afghanistan named Yasser Issam Hamdi successfully sued the U.S. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld for unlawful imprisonment. Hamdi had been born in Louisiana, was being held indefinitely without trial at the Naval Brig in Norfolk, Virginia. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that his constitutional rights had been violated, ordered him to be tried or freed. the ruling unfortunately failed to address the broader human rights issue of foreign nationals being held indefinitely without trial. Only in a democracy, not even in many of those, could a prisoner sue the Secretary of Defense during wartime and win. Democracies are not only good at thwarting autocratic rulers, they're good at winning wars. They tend to have vibrant economies, well-funded militaries, and a web of economic and military alliances that mean that if you attack one democracy, you might end up having to fight them all. When the Russian army invaded Ukraine in February 2022, its forces were quickly stopped by Ukrainians using advanced weapons from America and other democratic countries. Ukrainian soldiers were clearly willing to die in place to defend their freedom, while Russian soldiers were less willing to die, depriving them of it. Fearless leaders, the deep involvement of women, and a transcendent cause gave Ukrainians every advantage an underdog group can have against a more powerful foe. Unfortunately, no democratic coalition came to the aid of the Spanish government. In fact, they imposed an arms embargo. Spain was at the end of a senseless 20-year war in Morocco. Entire regiments of experienced and bitter combat troops were airlifted to Spain in planes provided by Hitler and Mussolini. These forces quickly routed rural militias armed mostly with shotguns and farm implements. An odd historical twist, thousands of Rif tribesmen from Morocco were also unleashed on Andalusia, given the go-ahead to rape, plunder, and kill as much as they pleased. Almost 500 years after the expulsion of the Moors from Spain, Franco managed to arrange for a reconquista of his own country by Moroccan irregulars who were so feared, civilians sometimes committed suicide rather than face them. Among thousands of such atrocities, Moroccan troops outside Malaga executed a couple accused of being anarchists only after the woman had been raped by every man in the firing squad. Regular Spanish units that joined Franco's armies were little better. Traumatized by the war in Morocco, they once lost 8,000 men in a single battle. Combat veterans saw themselves as the last bastion of Spanish honor, which made them feel entitled to decide what kind of country Spain would become. In their eyes, the left-wing Popular Front could be slaughtered with impunity because they had rejected both the Catholic Church and the feudal hierarchy that had long dominated Spain. In fact, the Popular Front had won the election handily, and their platform was consistent with broad economic reforms that were sweeping the world after a global depression. Among other things, they sought the emancipation of women and the right to civil divorce, land reform, wage increases, and the separation of church and state. War, such as the one waged by Spain and Morocco, are often a threat to political freedom because they produce millions of veterans who are both desensitized to violence and profoundly alienated from their fellow citizens. That is a bad combination. After the American Civil War, hundreds of thousands of traumatized men returned home and drove the violent crime rate in New York City up by 60%. Two-thirds of the men sent to northern state prisons that year were veterans. A prolonged war by national armies is likely to be followed by a period of social unrest, observed Eric Hoffer in The True Believer, his classic 1951 treatise on mass movements. The man just out of the army longs for certitude, camaraderie, freedom from individual responsibility, and a vision of something altogether different from the competitive free society all around him. Hoffer was a stevedore in Oakland, California, who became fascinated by similarities between the Nazis, the Russian communists, and the Ku Klux Klan. These movements were all grave threats to human dignity, and, says Hoffer, drew people who were frustrated and disappointed with their own lives. One of the most potent attractions of a mass movement is its offering a substitute for individual hope, he writes. There's an apparent connection between dissatisfaction with oneself and a proneness to credulity. The urge to escape our real self is also an urge to escape the rational and the obvious. The refusal to see ourselves as we are develops a distaste for facts and cold logic. High self-esteem seems to be a core trait that allows people to live in reality rather than in a belligerent fantasy where they are both victim and hero. Low self-esteem is clinically associated with depression, anger, hostility, psychosis, and alcohol and drug abuse, all traits that can make a person more vulnerable to mass movements. Many people cope with low self-esteem by assuming a rebellious stance, write Sheldon Solomon and two fellow authors in The Worm at the Core. They reserve for themselves that special sense of righteousness that comes from rejecting a corrupt, unfair, or constraining system. Such disillusionment can be precipitated by economic upheaval, technological and scientific innovations, environmental catastrophes, wars, plagues, or intrusions by other cultures. Franco's coalition couldn't have worked if it were composed solely of war veterans. It also included much of the country's power elite. Industrialists and large landowners allied themselves with Franco because they thought correctly he would keep Spain in its semi-feudal state. And the immensely wealthy Catholic Church, who was threatened by the secular goals of the Popular Front, offered a kind of blanket dispensation for the use of violence in exchange for staving off democratic rule. The illusion of a just Christian cause allowed frontline soldiers to be so contemptuous of civilians they rejected the very idea of elected government. Those who don't wear uniforms should wear skirts, they were fond of declaring. Once your opponent has been classified as not just wrong but evil, a kind of moral inversion occurs where the worse you act, the more noble you are. In fact, one of the surest signs that a society is losing its freedom is when entire groups find themselves blamed for the nation's problems. An American in Badajoz named John Allen saw 1,800 men, mostly laborers and union members, herded into a bull ring and machine gunned because fascist leaders decided Spain would be better off without them. South of Madrid, 20 pregnant women were taken from a maternity ward, driven to a cemetery, and shot for similar reasons. In Toledo, a brilliant American journalist named John Whitaker watched a pair of belt-fed machine guns dispatch 600 men in minutes. Rather than make the clergy rethink its commitment to the fascist cause, the carnage seemed to confirm their view that civilization itself was under threat. If it weren't, why were so many people dying? In Navarra, a Capuchin monk delivered a confession to a crowd of men standing in their own mass grave. In the Sierra Guadarrama, a Jesuit priest personally led an infantry charge while waving a crucifix. In Merchante, a deputy parish priest carried a pistol so that he could dispatch the wounded at mass executions. The wife of a Falangist officer in Talavera had a similar predilection, although she also shouted Viva Franco as she fired. If local priests had any reservations about the bloodlust they had sanctified, higher authorities provided guidance. German bishops issued a collective pastoral applauding Hitler's support of Franco. The Vatican sent an apostolic delegate to Spain that was soon reciprocated with a fascist ambassador to the Holy See. Once the purity of the fascist endeavor was established, a kind of death cult seemed to take hold. Fascist infantry charged machine guns, screaming, Viva la muerte, long live death. People gathered every morning in towns across Spain to enjoy the execution and see if the condemned would cry or beg or soil themselves. A union card could get you killed, or misidentification, or nothing at all. Some phalangists like to kill people on their saint's day, regardless of their politics, just to inspire terror and obedience. In Cordoba, a university professor made sure to wake his 14-year-old son every morning in time to see the executions. There were massacres on the government side, to be sure. They were stopped within months and did not represent official government policy. That was not true of the fascists. In fact, the political killings continued long after they had won the war. In the end, almost 1% of the Spanish population was executed for their beliefs. Throughout this horror, my father was safely ensconced in Paris and making his way through the French school system. The German army invaded the Netherlands on May 10, 1940, was standing on French soil within days. My father escaped Paris a few days before the Germans entered the city, relocated to Biarritz, where he saw advanced units of the German army patrolling the streets. When a German officer standing at the front of a tank column asked how to get to the city center, my father pointed the wrong way and said in German, that direction. By then, the Spanish Civil War was over, and Franco had declared himself caudillo, supreme leader for the rest of his life. To escape the Nazis, my father's family had to exchange their old Republican passports for new nationalist ones, which they managed to do at the Spanish consulate in Bayonne. By the time they drove across the border into Spain, the German swastika had already replaced the French tricolor. Eventually, my father, now 18, boarded a Portuguese freighter named Sao Tome, bound for Baltimore with a hold full of cork. Several weeks later, the Sao Tome steamed into Chesapeake Bay, and my father stepped ashore onto American soil. My father had come to America because he knew fascism never would. He tried to join the U.S. Navy, but was turned down because of his asthma. Instead, he did technical work on jet engines and submarine propellers. Much later, he would work on the Apollo space program. The United States is not always on the right side of history. We supported Franco and ignored Hitler for far too long, but eventually we sent hundreds of thousands of troops overseas to defeat fascism. The first time that fascistically minded people tried to attack the U.S. Capitol in 2001, their plan was to fly a passenger plane straight into it and wipe out Congress. A few brave souls forced the plane down into a field in Pennsylvania, killing everyone on board but saving the government. Almost 20 years later, more brave souls battled an armed mob in the marbled halls of the Capitol and saved our country once again. Capitol Police stood their ground during hours of hand-to-hand combat and stopped a mob that was rampaging through the building looking for elected officials to kill. We are blessed with an abundance of courage in this country, it seems. Over and over, people risk their lives for the rights of others. May that always be true. And that is the end of the book.